So today we're discussing the interpersonal process. One key facet of the interpersonal process is communication apprehension. You'll have an assignment related to communication apprehension, which is the anxiety associated with some sort of communicative exchange. We experience communication apprehension prior to giving a presentation in front of the class, or maybe confronting a friend, which might initiate a conflict, or prior to a stage performance, or sometimes just a big game. So communication apprehension is the extent to which people exhibit anxiety about speaking to others or performing. There are 6 types of communication. Your text mentions a 7th, which I'll highlight briefly. The first is intrapersonal, which is imagining or problem solving or self-talk that we have. It may occur in your life before you are going to bring something up to a boyfriend or girlfriend, a touchy subject. You might have some self-talk. You might think about how you're going to raise the discussion with your significant other. You might talk to yourself a bit before having the difficult conversation. Interpersonal communication is the process of message transaction between two people who work toward creating shared meaning. This is just like a one-on-one conversation. Interpersonal communication can also be like an email, one-to-one. Small group communication consists of members of a team who meet for a common purpose. I'm sure you've done that in classroom settings quite often, where you would meet with 3 or 4 other group members. Organizational communication occurs among large extended groups. This could be like one branch of the federal government exchanging information with another, like when the FBI shares details, crime details, with smaller local precincts. So this has to do with businesses, organizations, sharing data in some cases. Communication might be you're watching a television show or listening to radio. These are examples of you receiving mass communication. Your text discusses something interesting called mass personal communication, and this is like targeted mass communication. For example, on your Facebook page, you might receive a lot of messages related to relationships for some reason, because you have either indicated that you're interested in articles about relationships, books about relationships, or because you joined some groups on Facebook, and now you receive targeted messages personal to your self-identified interests, but mass, because this ad or this message is sent to 40,000, 50,000 different people. So that's the mass personal communication. If you want, you could think of that as the 7th type here. And finally, public communication, when one person gives a speech to a large audience without much interaction. So this is, in fact, the one-to-many, like a political speech. And you can often identify public communication because one person is facing at the audience and everybody else is looking back. So there are several models of communication that early theorists conceptualized. The first is the linear model of communication, which kind of set in motion some language that is still used today. The first is the sender, who is the source of the message. The second is the receiver, who is the intended target of the message. The third is the channel or the pathway to communication. A channel typically represents our senses. So if somebody is speaking, that would be on the auditory channel. If I smell something, that would be olfactory. The linear model also established noise, such as physical noise, physiological noise, psychological noise, and semantic noise. Physical noise is something like, in my immediate periphery here, I hear a lawnmower. That would be in the physical environment affecting my ability to focus or receive messages. Physical noise can also be something like if a clown would happen to do a cartwheel past me, I would be distracted from having a conversation with my friend because it would be so strange that I would be distracted. That's a physical noise because it exists in my environment. It doesn't necessarily have to be a sound. The visual noise, such as the clown, would be enough to affect message reception for me, right? I would get sidetracked or confused about what is happening in my other conversation. Physiological noise are biological influences, such as if I'm hungry, I am not going to be able to learn or listen to my professor. Other physiological noises might be like pain. If I'm in pain, I can't learn, I can't receive messages. Psychological noise refers to biases and prejudices, the feelings I might have towards a person. For example, if I'm a Philadelphia sports fan and a guy is wearing a Jets jersey from New York or a Yankees jersey, and he might be the coolest guy in the world, but anything out of his mouth, I just see him as the other. And I don't want to connect with him at all or be friendly simply because of some kind of bias I have towards New York athletic teams. And finally, semantic noise, which affects message reception, is when two individuals apply different meanings to the same message. Maybe I'm on the set of a rap video and somebody says to me, grab the ice off the table. And I'm thinking, oh shoot, he wants me to get him a drink, a water with ice in it. And in fact, maybe he meant the diamonds. So semantic noise can has to do with slang sometimes, or applying different meanings to the same message or words. So these are early models also considered context, which your text refers to a bit as climate. And we'll get more into looking at communication climate later this semester. But in terms of context, the context is the, as I mentioned, environment in which a message is sent. And that environment can change the meaning of how a message is received. For example, the physical context or the tangible environment can change the meaning of a message. For example, if you see a person facing the wall to speak, while they could maybe be a genius, your initial impression of them is that they're weird, or maybe that they're visually impaired. And it doesn't matter what they're saying. You're probably your perception of them is that there's something different about this person or wrong. Right? If they're facing a wall instead of facing directly at you to speak. The cultural context or the rules, roles, and norms of an environment are an aspect of context and affect the meaning of a message. For example, the rules of a classroom might be that the student comes in and sits down in the desk. You know that as a student, as soon as you enter the classroom, you sit down. And that's just simply a norm or an unwritten rule. And if you did not, if, for example, in a classroom, you stood the entire time rather than sitting down, again, people might discount what you have to say because you're kind of breaking the rules of or what is normal. Also, if you, rather than raise your hand to answer a question, if you raised your foot, anything you say moving forward from that is going to be received in a different way. People are going to think you're being comedic, for example, or you're weird, right? So the cultural context dictates what are proper behaviors. In that example, that culture is a school environment, affecting the behaviors of and the meaning of the behaviors in that environment. The social and emotional context, the nature of the relationship can affect the meaning. For example, I can very easily and without offending anyone say I love you if I am talking to my sister or my mother or my significant other. But if I say that to a student, I've just violated the social emotional context, the nature of our professional relationship, and I can get in trouble for that, right? So it's not that the fact that I'm saying I love you any different. It's simply the nature of the relationship between the two people, which can change the meaning. A professor and a student would be, of course, inappropriate. And finally, the historical context that messages are understood in relation to previous messages can change the meaning of a message. For example, you might have a really rough group of friends or a harsh group of friends that often say, "You're dead to me." And it's kind of a funny thing, and it's said so frequently in your group of friends that nobody takes offense to it or takes it seriously. But if you say that same thing to your father or your mother, they might take serious offense because they haven't been predisposed to this kind of ongoing reference or joke or in-group message that doesn't mean literally that you are dead to someone, right? So sometimes people have these ongoing group histories or jokes, language that they use that others would find super offensive, but in your group, you don't find it offensive at all. Okay, so beyond the linear model, the feedback model was then developed, suggesting that communication is two-way, not one-way, not linear. That feedback is characterized by responses to people and their messages. So rather than the sender sending a message to a receiver in the linear fashion, in the feedback model, communication is ongoing. For example, I may adapt my the next thing I say based on feedback from my audience, from my communication partner, from my spouse, or my sibling, right? So if I'm having a conversation, the next thing I say might change based on the kind of facial expression they make, or whether they're in agreement or disagreement, right? If I tell a joke and they seem to be offended, I might walk that joke back or say, I'm just kidding, right? So the feedback model suggests that the sender and receiver are both participants in the exchange of messages. Internal feedback and external feedback exist. Internal feedback would be self-talk that we discussed earlier, the intrapersonal communication. For example, if I'm having a conversation with someone I find attractive and I say something and they look disapprovingly at me, my self-talk might say, oh, you're an idiot, you're not attractive, she doesn't like you. And that internal feedback may have been triggered by some external feedback. For example, her weird look on her face, or a look of disgust on her face. Whereas my self-talk might say, oh, I think she likes me, if when I'm having this a conversation, externally I perceive that she's smiling or laughing at my jokes. So internal feedback is the self-talk I have, which affects the next thing I'm going to say. If, for example, a joke is working, I might continue with that theme, or I might continue to tell jokes in a conversation. If I get a dirty look, a bad look, side eye or something, then I might adapt. And the next thing I say might be more serious and not attempt to be funny, if my jokes aren't landing, right? So the feedback model suggests that while we still use the language from the from the linear model, sender, receiver, channel, and all of that stuff, that feedback is actually more important, that communication is ongoing rather than linear. Rather than from sender to receiver, it is in fact going back and forth because I'm adapting to the reactions of my audience. And finally, the transactional model not only suggests that feedback is occurring, but that the sender and receiver are actually equally as important. So the transactional model accepts the feedback model, but that not just that the sender is the speaker is important, but that the audience is just as important equally as the speaker. The receiver and the sender are creating shared meaning together as equal participants, even if the receiver is merely listening. So in the transactional model, field of experience plays a role in creating shared meaning. My expertise or understanding of a topic, for example, can shape how I perceive the information you're sharing with me. For example, if I'm at a stand-up comedy act and somebody makes a joke about something off color racially, and I have personally experienced racial bias in my life before, I might not find that funny. Whereas 90% of the audience is laughing, I might look at that comedian unfavorably. So my field of experience plays a role in my reception of that message. If I'm a comedian and I'm in a room full of people who have experienced racial bias and I'm telling racial jokes, then maybe none of my jokes land and I get booed off the stage. Whereas if I'm in a room with people who haven't experienced it to a terrible degree and think it's funny, maybe my jokes land. I can send those jokes in the same manner, but because of the audience's field of experience, it results in a different outcome. In one instance, I get a lot of laughs. In the other, I get booed off the stage. The transactional model suggests that message transaction is a process. For example, my joke, it's ongoing, ever-changing, and irreversible. It's ongoing because my audience will always remember that joke that I said, and forever, I might be offensive to them because of a joke I said that had race involved. It's ever changing, not because my joke is different, but because the person who you are is different. For example, when you're 18, you might take offense to a joke about race. But when you're 35, married, in a interracial relationship, maybe you no longer take offense to it and you think it's funny because your wife is like that, in your opinion. So it's ever changing, while that joke hasn't changed in your, as who you are changes, your understandings of the world change. And it's irreversible. Of course, if you probably know this, if somebody ever said something offensive to you in the past, they can never take it back, right? And all the good that they do can never take that one thing that they said or did back. So once we communicate something, we can't take it back. The transactional model imagines or looks at all of these things, that field of experience is at play, and that the message transaction is a process. It's ongoing, ever-changing, and irreversible due to cultural and personal changes. I'm not the same person with the same experiences today as I was 10 years ago. So the transactional model looks at message exchange as the verbal and nonverbal sharing of messages. These things interact, right? So if somebody tells a joke, an off-color joke, that, and maybe they're not smiling, you might be offended. But if they're smiling and laughing while they tell the joke, you might be more likely to think it was funny because they're clearly meaning it in a harmless way by their nonverbal, by their smiling or what have you, right? So it's not just the words, it's the entire, the delivery is also an aspect of the transaction. Meaning, of course, is what people extract from the communication. I think of what you said to me and I put it in context of my own experience. Whether or not I find something offensive is based on the meaning that I extract from it. And that meaning is affected by culture. The cultures I've been privy to, that I've experienced myself, or that I identify as a professor or a comedian or a lyricist or a father, and I apply those different meanings that I have to words, or those experiences to the words that I perceive, and it has maybe different meanings in different contexts based on my culture and experiences. So words themselves have no meaning except for the meaning that we assign to those words. And language, interestingly, the meanings of words changes over time. So communication is on a continuum, and it kind of measures the impersonal to the personal. Impersonal meaning more professional, while personal meaning more unprofessional, more laxed, maybe more emotion involved. So on that continuum, the impersonal to the personal It depends on relational history, relational rules, and relational uniqueness. The history might be, for example, how long we've known each other. If we've known each other a long time, it's likely that we have it is maybe more likely that we have a personal relationship, unless that relationship has been in the workplace. So I may know some personal things about you, which affects our relationship. The rules of our relationship, maybe my significant other, a rule in our relationship might be that she never tell me about her ex-boyfriend or earlier relationships because I don't want to know about that. And if she did talk a lot about him, I would be offended. So these might be the relational rules that we have, that we've negotiated based on the fact that maybe I'm a little jealous, and for me, ignorance is bliss about some of my loved ones' past before they knew me. And on this continuum, we also measure or can think of the relational uniqueness. For example, how that relationship for my significant other with me might be very different from her prior boyfriend, who wanted to know everything about her dating history. So people exist in terms of their expectations and the way that they treat relationships on a continuum, and no one person is the same communicator. Remember that the relationship you have with someone doesn't always dictate whether the communication is personal or not. For example, even though she may be my significant other, I can ask her a very impersonal question like, did you get the milk? And the answer can be yes. Have you completed the task? The answer can be yes. So on that continuum, even though we have a very personal relationship, that message itself was quite impersonal. So, and then reflecting on the linear, feedback, and then transactional models, we've used this similar language throughout, but added more complexity and understanding and nuance to the process of communication. Some principles of interpersonal communication are that as hard as we try, we cannot avoid communicating. In other words, we cannot stop others from making meaning about us, judging us. Communication is irreversible. For example, once I've said something, I can't ever take it back. You might have heard a loved one say, I can forgive, but I can't forget that thing that you said to me. Words and symbols are arbitrary. It means that we make meaning from symbols, even though different cultures or different individuals might make a different meaning from it. They're arbitrary because they are, the understanding of what things mean is a negotiation between me and my conversation partner or my audience or what have you. And we can disagree or agree upon those meanings. So there are interesting symbols in human history that take on different meanings in different cultures. I'll show some on the slide. Interpersonal communication is rule governed, and those rules are agreed upon or disagreed upon, obeyed or violated based on our own fields of experience or cultures or understanding of correct behaviors in a context. And in any communication or exchange, content, the words I'm saying and relationship information is conveyed. So you can tell how someone feels about you, not only by their diction, but maybe their nonverbal, their batting of their eyes, their smiles, their gaze, the way they hold their hands could be formal, like a president, or informal, like your friend when she's telling a story. Some myths of interpersonal communication permeate culture, and we've heard some of these, that interpersonal communication solves all problems. A lot of times your friends might say to you, you're not communicating with your boyfriend, your girlfriend, and that's the problem. And you might think, nope, actually everything is good until we talk, until we bring up the past, then we argue. But when we're together, not saying anything, the relationship is better. So interpersonal communication in terms of speaking doesn't always solve problems. It can make things worse. Interpersonal communication is always a good thing. This is another myth, because the dark side of interpersonal communication, of course, exists. For example, sometimes somebody might say something to me inappropriate, and it doesn't fix the situation, it makes it worse. Another myth is that interpersonal communication is common sense. This is definitely not true, because cultures, genders, and people of different experiences communicate differently. For example, if I am wearing something on my head indoors, my Irish Catholic grandmother might be might be upset about that, whereas a Jewish man would be expected to do that, and it would be rude otherwise. So just like taking your shoes off at the door, culturally, some people might find you strange if you take your shoes off at the door, and others might find you strange if you do not. So there are some good examples of communication not being common sense. Different cultures look at things, behaviors differently. And the final myth is that interpersonal communication is always face-to-face. It, of course, is not. Interpersonal communication can be mediated, like via email, which is one-to-one, or like on a FaceTime. So that's not necessarily face-to-face because it's mediated on a screen, but it is interpersonal communication. The last part that we want to talk about today is ethics, and how ethics exist in our communications, and our perceived rightness or wrongness of an action or behavior. I personally love the Reddit stories, AITA, which is MI the a-hole stories about basically interpersonal fails, when people are describing, was I a jerk or was not I a jerk when I said this to my wife or my husband and they did this. I find it fascinating how you can have so many different opinions in these chats when people are examining the behavior of others. So we tend to look at behaviors and communications through different lenses, judging whether they were correct or incorrect. And that's often because we have different ethical systems. So there are 5 ethical systems of communication. The first is the categorical imperative, which is a moral imperative, which suggests that consequences are not important, only the principle is important. For example, you should tell the truth even if it will deeply harm your loved ones, knowing that truth. Utilitarianism suggests that we should do the greatest good for the greatest amount of people with our communication, with our behaviors. For example, that means we should donate money to the poor in other countries because we can save more lives where the dollar goes further than in the United States, where you might only be able to feed 10 people per year with your donation, whereas in Southeast Asia, maybe 100 or 1,000 based on your donation. The ethic of care would be kind of the opposite of utilitarianism in the prior example. The ethic of care means you're concerned with connection and the people in your immediate vicinity and helping them. So you kind of value loyalty. In the prior example, in terms of where you would donate your money, you would donate to people in the United States. Even though you're only going to save 5 or 10 of those people, you would help them first over a group of people on the other side of the planet. So the ethic of care is concerned with the connections I have with people, basically loyalty over, in some cases, truth. And finally, significant choice suggests that communication is ethical because it maximizes potential for free choice. This suggests that you should tell people and allow them to make up their own opinion about things. Finally, the golden mean suggests there might be harmony and balance or rationality in our communications, in our choices. In the example I've been going with, somebody who is applying the golden mean to making the decision, should I donate to a group of Americans or a group of Southeast Asians, they might say, you know what, let me give half to the folks in the United States and half to the folks in Southeast Asia because I can't decide. So sometimes when we experience communication, we judge others based on ethical systems, and sometimes those ethical systems, interestingly, are in conflict, which is why we might disagree with some other viewpoint.